Ladies and gentlemen, the presentation is starting. Paul, please go ahead.
Thank you, George, and welcome everybody to Rethink Your Big Four Monitoring Tools, a webcast presented by Uptime Software. My name is Paul Gillen, and I'll be your host and moderator. And in a moment, we'll hear from David Leith, Technical Product Manager at Uptime Software. So now let's move on to today's topic. How much do you pay for system monitoring software? Our speaker today would submit that it's too much, probably way too much. The vendors that dominate the system monitoring business have been around for a long time, and their license fees are more in keeping with the standards of the early 90s than today's more flexible structures. They also require significant amounts of manual labor. Now, our speaker, David Leith, will show you some startling statistics in this area as he makes the case that the Big Four monitoring frameworks are outdated, overpriced, require costly maintenance, and don't really help IT improve services enough to justify their huge investment. Uptime Software is one of the new breed of IT systems management companies that specializes in an emerging data center world that's dominated by virtual services and application monitoring. Rather than trying to be all things to all people, Uptime focuses on the services that matter most, and it's rigorous about taking manual effort out of the process. David Leith is the Technical Product Manager for Uptime. He has 15 years of management experience in technology, client services, and military environments. In his 9 years with Uptime, he has worked closely with customers in hundreds of data centers. David, welcome.
All right, thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. So I'd like to take a moment to just thank everyone for attending today. I'm really excited to be here. I know we have a lot of content to go through, so I'll jump right into it. So today I'm really hoping to answer three specific questions for you. We're hoping that most of you are using a framework or Big Four tool today. So I want to try to answer the question, and bring some light on just how much those framework tools and that cost of monitoring is in your environment. And when we're talking about the Big Four and frameworks specifically, we're talking about the BMCs, CAs, HP, and IBM, and to a certain extent, Microsoft. Right, so we're going to talk a little bit about how much those types of big framework tools can cost in your environment for that basic cost of monitoring. Then talk a little bit about, is that solution really delivering what you need in order to move your IT department forward and to improve your service delivery from your data centers? And then, of course, I'm hoping to answer the question, simply how can you do better? So to frame this conversation, I'm going to talk in three different sections. So the first one, I'm going to talk a little bit about a cost model to figure out how much your Big Four tools are actually costing you in your environment, including all of the external and additional costs that are necessarily on the sticker price. I'm going to talk about what you can expect from the next generation of tooling, so tools like Uptime Software. Right? What do they offer over top of the Big Four framework tools that you may not realize that you're missing out on by using those frameworks? And then talk about how you can make that transition, start reducing your costs, and move towards improving your IT performance. So let's start off by talking about the total cost of monitoring in your environment. Now, I'm going to talk through an example for most of this session. It's kind of an amalgamated example of a few different users that we've dealt with in the last year, but primarily we're going to talk about somebody named Wally. And Wally was responsible for the monitoring in a financial institution, a few data centers spread across the globe, monitoring somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 servers. And what Wally was responsible for was coming in and reviewing their overall monitoring package and seeing whether it was delivering on their needs and whether there was any efficiency or cost savings that could be found. So as he started looking at the data center and really analyzing how their operations team was using monitoring day to day and what they were hoping to deliver with that, he discovered that they were using about 7 different monitoring tools in their environment. So what they ended up using was a combination of a few different modules of one of the big framework tools, covering off about 90% of their monitoring needs. But then they had a few other point tools specifically for the network environment. So this is probably not an uncommon scenario. It's very typical to have multiple different tools in larger data centers. And unfortunately, that is a very common scenario because what we'd like to see is a smaller number of tools, much more streamlined operations. So when Wally started looking at this problem, identifying the 7 different tools and trying to figure out how much it really costs them for that monitoring package, what he ended up discovering was that his total cost of monitoring on a yearly basis was about $575,000 per year. Now, you may look at this number and be quite surprised, either on the high end or the low end. This is a general example from a number of recent clients that we've dealt with. But it's not particularly abnormal, right? Certainly when we first started running these numbers and when Wally started running these numbers, he was very surprised to see the high price associated with his current monitoring package. So let's talk a little bit about that total cost of monitoring and how Wally arrived at that number. So to calculate your total cost of monitoring, of course you're going to start off with some of the things that are very easy to identify. And the most common cost, the most direct cost, is of course just your annual support. That's very straightforward. Unfortunately, there's a number of other costs associated with simply maintaining the monitoring platform that aren't always fully realized and aren't rolled into the total cost of monitoring. So these start off with a rather large bucket, professional services. So of course many of these framework tools basically come with a full professional services consulting package to help ease the initial setup and deployment of these tools. But the reality of these consulting packages is that they tend never to end. So maybe it's about a month of consulting that's originally required to do the so-called initial deployment. But then you discover over time, as things start to evolve, those consultants may be required on an ongoing full-time basis simply to maintain your tooling. So we include in professional services things you should be looking for and rolling into your total cost and understanding, that setup cost and the configuration time. Look for costs related to the upgrades. A number of tools have a very extensive upgrade process. Lots of little things that need to be considered to ensure that you don't lose any production monitoring. There's going to be a major cost involved in simply keeping this software up to date to ensure you're getting the most value of the newer features. And of course, any customizations. Many data centers have customized applications that need to be monitored in a very specific way, and you'll want to tune your monitoring engine to specifically monitor your environment. So there's almost always some level of customization required. Then we have standard things like tuning and, of course, the training. Many of these Big Four framework tools are highly complex and highly detailed engines. So you need a very extensive training package involved with the rollout of these to ensure that your team understands how to use these tools and understands how to extract the most value from them. And the last bucket that we like to roll into this total cost of monitoring, in addition to the annual support and the professional services fee, is just a blanket management cost. And a big one here is really the staffing. So many of these tools, in addition to those professional services members who are on site at your data center maintaining these tools, you also have your own full-time staff. And in Wally's case, he found that he was employing anywhere between 2 and 4 people full-time simply to manage the monitoring environment. So that's not actually behaving as operations staff. They aren't out there resolving any issues. They aren't rolling out new servers or doing anything valuable like that. They are purely just ensuring that their monitoring day-to-day is completely up to date and in line with the operational processes that the other teams using the monitoring platform are expecting. Then you have your hardware costs. So how much does it cost to actually provision the servers and the database and storage requirements to host your monitoring applications? And then the last one that we include in management costs is all about license management. So this is a little bit different than license fees. License fees are usually very straightforward and very well known. But what Wally discovered was that each year, having all of these different products rolled out in their environment, all these different modules, there's really about a 6 to 8 week project each year simply to determine what their license allocation actually was and whether their platforms were in compliance with all of the right monitoring pieces required. So simply understanding, am I using what I'm paying for? Do I need to get more, or can I roll back on my annual support number a little bit? That in itself was a pretty tremendous project and not something that was really adding any value to the monitoring platform, really just administration costs. So when Wally looked at each of these 3 buckets, the cost that he arrived at was around $150,000 a year for his annual support. And again, this may be high or low for your environment depending on the number of servers and the types of different modules that you're using in these frameworks. Professional services, easily $100,000, right? To have a few people on staff for the year or a portion of a year, this is an incredible amount of money. right? And then the management costs ongoing. So believe it or not, $300,000 in his own staffing, own license management. So all of these numbers are focused on the ongoing costs of your monitoring. So this is the year after your initial deployment. So of course there's a cost associated with simply purchasing a new tool and doing that initial deployment. These costs were all of the costs down the road, so in year 2, year 3, year 4. And they're still adding up, right? These are still very, very high numbers to be looking at year to year, well past that initial purchase fee. Now, Wally was also focusing on another key question. So looking at the monitoring platform, finding that they had 7 tools and using different portions of a Big Four framework as well as those point tools, he really started to realize that there was a lot of inefficiency inherently in having multiple tools from the management and cost point of view, but also from an incident triage and a pure availability point of view. And he started to really uncover that there is a tremendous hidden cost with a number of these tools that Wally really wanted to speak to. And that hidden cost was the cost of downtime in his environment. Now, this is something you may or may not have any visibility to in your environment, as it can be something that can be hard to arrive at and really understand the cost of downtime. But to give you a rough number that many users have encountered, and this is coming directly from Gartner Corporation, they conservatively peg the cost of downtime at $42,000 per hour. Now, that in itself is a pretty huge number, so you can imagine just how this adds up over time. Now, if your mission-critical applications, of course, are providing applications that are directly revenue-generating, such as a website where users are placing orders, this number could be orders of magnitude higher, potentially up to millions of dollars within a half-hour window or a few minutes windows if you have a financial trading platform. But this $42,000 per hour is a rough estimate across all the data centers in North America. So this includes not just those revenue loss costs, but also all of the costs for staffing and trying to triage problems, all the costs related to simply trying to recover services and restore applications and get around that downtime. Now, a few other interesting numbers that go along with this is that using this multiple tool approach, track research found that only 16% of organizations are actually able to proactively prevent any type of performance issue in their environment. They also found that 63% of organizations found that using multiple tools, it was very difficult to actually correlate data across these different sources. So the best example of this is having different siloed teams using different tools. So the network team has their own module or their own point tool. Storage team has their own. Virtualization team has their own. And that organization, from a monitoring point of view, is very normal, but it also is very detrimental to actually restoring services because there's always miscommunication and a little bit of finger pointing between the different tools. So Wally really became very aware of these costs of the framework tool and their overall monitoring package, what those things were meaning to his organization, just from a raw dollar value point of view, but then also the inefficiencies and the cost of downtime related potentially to using multiple tools. I think at this point, before we move on to the next section, we're going to stop for a quick poll.
That's right, David. We want to find out a little bit about our audience and what tools they're using right now. So if we can move ahead to the first poll slide. The question, how much do you spend on monitoring per year? Don't know. Up to $10,000, $10,000 to $50,000, $50,000 to $100,000, $100,000 to $250,000, $250,000 to $500,000, or $500,000 or more. And David, as we're waiting for the results to come in, I wonder if organizations consider the reputational risks of downtime these days, in addition to the lost transactions, the possibility that customers may flee and not come back.
That's a very real cost. There's a whole movement right now in IT and really being able to prove the value of IT back to the business, particularly with cloudification of services and users being able to provision their own services on demand from outside of the IT department. It's very essential for IT to provide a top-notch user experience and be able to prove back to the business that they're really delivering on their overall budget cost.
Essential to the business. Let's take a look at our results. And what we see is that most of our audience is in the middle, 100 to 250,000, which is a little bit below where your numbers were, David, but certainly a very big number.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, it's not untypical. A lot of the numbers that we're reviewing today are based, on that kind of middle tier data center size, and the specifics of the size of your data center, as well as the specific tooling that you're using, and even the scope of your monitoring platform has a lot of impact on these costs.
All right, let's move ahead to the next slide, please. And David, please continue the presentation.
All right. So in this next section, continuing with the story of Wally, now that Wally had been able to identify that real cost of monitoring and the cost of downtime in his environment, really started to ask, can I do better? Right? Are there tools out there that would allow me to save a little bit of money and move forward and provide higher value out of my IT department back to my business? So he broke this discussion down in a few ways. So at a very high level, he was comparing the Big Four frameworks versus the next generation tools like Uptime. And there are five main kind of costs or potentially soft items that he was looking for. So of course, just that cost and value, finding that the Big Four framework tools were incredibly expensive from as we've proven in the last few slides. Took a look out in the market and found that there were a number of tools available that were much cheaper. Right? Deployment time, he factored that into his conversation. So many of the Big Four tools claim around a 12 to 18-month deployment time. The reality may be quite different. We find that a number of framework tools, the deployment never really ends, right? And these tools end up being in place simply because they have been the standard for many years, and no one's really looking at whether there is something better out there. Right, so that deployment just drags on. Maybe the tools actually fall to the wayside and aren't even being used. Many of the newer generation tools like Uptime, you can deploy in less than a month. We've dealt with a number of users of the framework who were actually in a position where at the end of their year, they received a bill from their vendor saying, here's your support cost for the upcoming year. Do you care to renew? They've looked at that cost and decided it was just far too high, too much to bear, and they've been able to look at a solution like Uptime and actually evaluate it and roll it out into production in their environment before their support contract actually elapsed for their framework tool. So that's a pretty big statement to be able to make, is the ability to actually rip and replace a framework tool before you need to go through signing the 3-month contract on your renewal. Then we started looking at the ease of use side. So, of course, the framework tools are highly complex. They need that training. And generally speaking, if you're using a modularized approach, you need to have multiple different tools open at once to really get to the root of any one issue and be able to compare and correlate data across these different modules. Whereas newer tools like Uptime, easy, single web interface to do all of your configurations, accessible via your mobile device and online from anywhere you are. Unified tooling. So, of course, we talked about the module side. You should be looking for a tool that provides that unified view of IT health, a central set of dashboards where you can see everything in your environment. And then also the licensing stance. So Wally really didn't want to have to go through and produce spreadsheets of his different sizes of servers, the number of CPUs, the different OS versions. He was really looking for a simplified model where he simply had to count the number of distinct OS instances in his environment and say, what is this number times my blanket license fee? Very simple to calculate what your upcoming renewal cost will be, and calculate what your net new license cost will be as you add additional platforms in your environment. So clearly the newer generation of tools from Wally's point of view were a win in this department. The next thing he looked at was really the functionality. Well, of course, if you're paying a lot for a framework tool, you're paying for it because it can do everything. You want that tool, that kit or overall solution that will provide every little thing that you possibly need to do within your IT organization. But when Wally sat back and looked at it, he was really asking, okay, we know we want to do all of these things, but can we get all of these individual capabilities such as dashboarding, servers, networks, applications, end user experience, your capacity management? Can we get all of those things from a different tool? What are we giving up functionality-wise to go with a tool that isn't as expensive as the frameworks and is a little bit easier to use? And when he started looking at Uptime, it really became apparent that you're going to get about 80 to 90% of the total functionality of the framework tools, but you're going to get that for 10% to 20% of the overall cost. So the question then comes down to, are the missing pieces, is some of the depth and specialized areas not really providing the value that you think it's going to, right? We tend to run into a lot of users who, basically overspend, right? They think by going with a framework tool, they're going to end up getting something that they can guarantee is going to work, right? No one's going to get fired for buying IBM, right? They think that they're going to need all of this additional in-depth functionality, but really they find that a lot of that functionality, it's kind of like Microsoft Word. You end up using about 10 to 20% of the actual functionality of the product, right? So he really took a hard look at this and discovered, no, we can get all the same functionality from a different set of tooling, so there's no reason that we need to maintain using the framework tool simply because we have it in place. He also started to ask some very direct questions about their monitoring process, so talking about that efficiency again. He started to identify things that he simply wasn't able to do with his framework tool that he wanted to look for in other tools. Maybe the framework tool was actually offering it, but for various reasons they weren't able to get it to function correctly in their environment, or simply wasn't adaptable enough to fit within their data center. So the first thing he clearly wanted functionality-wise, outside of the matrix we just talked about, is a tool that allows him to watch over his entire IT infrastructure and his IT delivery process from a single view. Right, he wanted to find a tool that didn't depend very much on manual tasks and could really keep pace with change in his data center. So most virtualized data centers today are adding or removing new resources, new OS instances at a rate that just possibly cannot be kept up with by hands-on interaction. Well, he wanted to find a tool that he could automate to handle much of the day-to-day routine and ensure that it was always in lockstep with changes in the environment without any manual overhead. He also wanted to ensure that he could actually auto-recover his systems and services after there was an outage. He wanted to ensure that there was self-healing involved in both the availability side of things in his environment, but also the capacity side. So did his monitoring platform have the capability to detect capacity changes in their environment and reallocate resources to ensure that there isn't going to be a potential outage of a service based on lack of available resources? You want something that was very topology aware, that could discover that topology and ensure that these incidents that were occurring, that there wasn't going to be any confusion between whether it was the network team's fault, whether it was the server team's fault, virtualization's fault. You want something that would be able to identify the root cause of the problem and notify the right team at the right time so that they could focus on actually recovering the services instead of just figuring out where that root cause actually was. And then he also wanted to ensure that he could measure the availability of key business metrics and report those back to users. So we talked a little bit about proving the value of IT back to the business. He wanted to ensure that he could collect those metrics and report on them in a way that made sense for his end users. Now, the tool he ended up landing on, of course, I'm from Uptime Software, right? Wally ended up talking to us, and what Uptime was able to offer him is a single unified IT dashboard that allowed him to monitor and alert and report on his availability, performance, and capacity across all of their applications and IT services, including the user experience, all of their network devices, all of their virtual servers, physical servers, and cloud. And for those certain things that from the framework suite, such as the CMDB that he wanted to maintain, he was looking for something with an API that would make it easy to integrate with his monitoring engine with his other IT tools, so that one kind of single version of the truth and one platform could be used to monitor and manage the entire environment. So I think we're going to stop for our second poll.
And let's go to that second poll right now. And in this one, we want to know a little bit about the tools you use. Which vendor does your primary monitoring today? BMC, HP, CA or NIMSoft, IBM, a cloud-based vendor, open source tools such as Nagios, Zabbix, Ganglia. I haven't even heard of some of these, I have to admit, David. Low-cost tools like SolarWinds, What's Up Gold. David, you'd be surprised that there's only one option here, but it sounds like chances are that most of our listeners are using several of these tools.
Yeah, we're really looking for who is the primary vendor, right? So who's that vendor that's giving you the overall framework with all the different modules, and you go to as your kind of first source or primary monitoring tool.
So let's see who's the leading Uber vendor here, and a mix between HP, IBM, and some open source and low cost tools predominantly dominating the marketplace right now. Any surprises in those results, David?
Generally we do see a fairly good mix, right? Typically HP and IBM are a little bit more popular because they can bundle the management tooling with the actual hardware platforms. I'm a little bit surprised to see BMC at a whopping 0%. At least that's the latest on my side. So let's move on to the last portion of the presentation. So we talked a little bit about what you should be looking for in terms of identifying that total cost of monitoring your environment and realizing what some of those framework tools are actually costing you year to year. Talked a little bit about what you can look for from that next generation of tooling. Let's talk more about making this transition and get into a real world before and after on how you can reduce costs with uptime. So there's a few general guidelines that we like to provide for how you can reduce that total cost of monitoring, or TCM as we call it. The first step is fairly obvious. You need to know your total cost of monitoring. If you can't monitor this, you can't hope to change it. If you are in a position where you're using what we call tool soup, so if you have multiple different solutions in place, maybe it is different modules of the same vendor, or maybe it is a collection of point tools and framework tools, you really need to step back, stop the insanity, and stop wasting your time. Right? 41% of organizations, believe it or not, are using 10 or more products to manage IT performance. Just thinking about the raw scope of the inefficiency in that is mind-boggling. So if you are using many tools, search out a tool consolidation. Try to find something that will cover off more of the bases for you day to day. Right? And if you are using one of these big four frameworks, you really should be looking for a cheaper alternative, right? Many of these frameworks, as I mentioned before, are simply in place today because they always have been, right? So they were very popular 10 or 15 years ago, and they've been in place and never really been displaced. We're now in the second and third generation of monitoring solutions. You'll find that there's a tremendous cost saving that can be had by looking for something a little bit newer. I've put 400 to 500% savings, and that is actually not a typo based on many of the users that we talk to. So you want to be able to define and continually measure ROI and TCM, right? Be able to trend them out over time, be able to get early recognition on a monthly basis or quarterly basis if your total cost of monitoring is starting to change. If it's changing, try to identify why it's changing. Remember, the key is to be able to track the total cost and really identify the total sum of costs related to your monitoring platform so that you can start watching that trend and make intelligent decisions moving forward. And of course, how can you reduce your total cost of monitoring? Be smarter, move on to being a bit more proactive in your environment. Let's talk about this example savings comparison. So we talked a little bit about Wally's total cost initially, right? Well over $500,000. Now let's talk a little bit about what it ended up costing him after the fact. So after choosing to move to uptime and rolling out uptime in his environment, he found that the annual support was reduced from $150,000 down to $25,000 per year. That's an incredible savings. He also found that in professional services, in his case, he ended up not needing any training. Right? His staff were already versed enough, found the tool easy to use. They didn't need any professional services to help roll things out initially. They didn't need professional services to help with upgrades or customizations down the road. So he was able to completely eliminate the professional services cost required with his monitoring platform. And in terms of management cost, he's able to reduce this almost entirely. He found that instead of employing 2 to 4 people full-time to manage his monitoring platform, they really needed about a quarter of a person to manage his uptime deployment. So not even one full-time staff. And so that's an incredible amount of savings between the framework solution and a solution like uptime. And then a net effect for him was his new total cost of monitoring was less than $50,000. So while he was able to save almost $500,000 each year in year 2 and year 3, All right, so if you can go back to your CIO or your VP of IT and say that you're going to save $500,000 simply through revisiting your framework platform, that's a really good choice, right? You're always going to come off looking pretty good, like Wally did, recognizing ROIs of well over the 500% mark by reducing all of those costs that are kind of buried in the total cost of monitoring in your environment. Now the key question, so if you've gone through this exercise, you've been able to identify your total cost of monitoring, you've looked for a new solution, you're starting to implement it and starting to realize a number of those efficiencies and savings, then you really have the next question. Where do you spend the extra time? Right? So clearly if you had staff who were working on monitoring before, you can try to repurpose those staff to work on things that will actually help to improve your IT service delivery. Right, so focus on getting a little bit more proactive in your environment. In Wally's case, you decided to focus on three different things. So the first thing is that you wanted to address that automation problem that he had with the framework tools. You wanted to implement an automated incident self-healing mechanism that would ensure that any easily recoverable services, instead of them needing a manual intervention to recover, they would actually be fully automated. So that was able to improve his mean time to recover tremendously in his environment. He also wanted to spend this time focusing on proving the value of IT back to the business. So it's taking some of those key indicators, rolling them up into a nice set of reports that you could actually send out to his end users, so non-technical users of the data center and of IT, prove to them that IT service was actually improving over time and that the budget that was assigned to IT was actually worth every penny, particularly when we had the cost savings from a new monitoring platform. And then you want to take those key indicators that he was now able to track and able to focus on collecting and start moving towards formalized SLAs in his environment. So Uptime provides out-of-the-box SLA monitoring that will help you take maybe basic SLAs such as simple availability in your environment and really move those up the chain to become much more valuable mechanisms in your environment to prove back that IT is delivering on its objectives. So we've talked about how to identify what your Big Four framework tools are really costing you in your environment, provided a simple worksheet for how to identify those costs. Talked a little bit about what you can expect from the next generation of tools like Uptime. Right, there's certainly some compelling arguments there. We would really like you to come take a look at Uptime and see for yourself the power of this next generation of tooling. Then we talked a little bit about real-world cost reductions that we have seen in our example user base and how to make that transition and how to focus some of those misallocated resources to really improve your IT performance and your service delivery over time. So I believe we're now going to wait a few moments and move into the Q&A section of the presentation.
Well, we do have some questions that have come in, so why don't we start running down them right now. You see on your screen resources that are available to you, including a 30-day free trial. Those links are also in the PDF of the presentation, which you can download. So question about what if you can't exit your vendor contract right away? Is that lock-in a problem?
That's a great question. We do see that quite a bit, particularly in environments where they have opted for a 2 or 3 year services engagement, or if there is potentially a master service agreement where there's potentially a relationship with IBM to provide massive portions of the overall IT infrastructure outside of just the monitoring side. What we've seen a number of users do in those environments is basically start a slow transition across to a newer tooling, potentially where over a series of years towards the end of the contract, they reduce their number of monitored elements under the framework tool every year and ramp up the number of elements that are actually monitored by a more modern, cheaper solution. Or potentially find a happy medium where the framework tool would monitor some of the most critical production systems, and the secondary tool would monitor the less high impact servers.
Okay, there's a question here about reporting, and not really a question so much as a statement, is saying that the the weakness of these products is usually in the reporting itself. Is that something that you found to be the case? And,
in terms of sorry, I'm getting a lot of feedback there. In terms of the reporting in a number of framework tools, yes, definitely. Depending on
reporting. I'm sorry to step on you, Dave. Please.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm getting a lot of echo back at this point. So the question is about the reporting challenges with framework tools. Is that correct?
And I think what the question is asking is, how does your reporting compare to the installed incumbents?
Oh, absolutely. So generally, Uptime's reporting is very focused on providing high-value reports that are consumable by both the technical staff for a triage and root cause analysis point of view. So great depth in the technical reports, but also providing an array of reports that are very focused on some of those business metrics and framed in a way that can easily be presented back to IT management or to actual end users. Right, and the key there is being able to produce a nice, clean-looking output that can be distributed automatically in that user-consumable format. And a lot of the framework tools simply can't get there. Right? They're very focused on the IT department and the IT department only, whereas Uptime's reporting is much more flexible and certainly for the IT availability and SLA tracking, much more focused on providing something that can be sent directly to end users.
Right, right. The question about whether the tool integrates well with any ticketing solutions that are currently available.
Yes, absolutely. Uptime is a monitoring platform, so the help desk side is something that we don't directly speak to. But what we do offer is easy integration with a number of the most common ticketing systems out there. Events from Uptime can be forwarded to other applications, either via SNMP Trap or direct gateway integration, for example, out to a Remedy platform. To take any of the incidents or detected outages in Uptime, forward that info over to the ticketing system so that you have a seamless IT process to respond to any of the outages that are detected.
One of our listeners would like to know more about automation, about what level of automation is provided. Can you go into some more detail on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Uptime provides a number of different automation options out of the box. So I'm talking, let's just say, particularly about self-healing and being able to recover from outages and manage the inventory. Uptime has a number of gateways into management tools such as VMware's vCenter, where we are able to automatically discover that virtual instances or ESX servers or clusters have been provisioned or deprovisioned and automatically adjust monitoring appropriately to ensure that the full monitoring pack or the full compliance pack for systems monitoring is applied to anything new, and that any of those newly detected items are placed into the operations alerting stream so there's no blind spots in your environment. Now, if any outages are detected, we offer out-of-the-box automation features such as restarting processes on the target machine, executing system-level commands to try to recover different services. We also offer a simple API in that regard where anything that can be basically scripted via PowerShell, Bash script, PHP, whatever, any of those scripted events can be executed by Uptime on the user's behalf to try to recover any complicated applications that you may be running.
And another listener's interesting question asked about the Wally example you provided. How might you scale that example down to a smaller data center with a monitoring budget of, say, $15,000 to $20,000 per year?
Mm-hmm. How would you go about scaling that down, or
that example that you had the example of how much Wally was really spending on
mm-hmm.
Monitoring? How might that scale to a smaller data center? And he's saying,
well, it's a really hard. That's a really hard question to answer because I find the specifics of your cost model are going to be based on a number of different aspects. So One of the first ones is simply how much of the framework tools you're actually using. So depending which modules you have enabled, which products within the suite you have opted to use in your environment, that will have a dramatic impact on your support renewal costs. So your renewal costs could be much lower in a smaller environment, or it could actually end up being much higher depending on the specific modules that you've opted to use. And then you talk about the overall configuration requirement and usage requirement, and that's usually where a number of the professional services costs end up coming into play. So when you are using multiple modules, you need to make all of those modules kind of play nicely together and work well from an overall operations point of view. That can become very complex and require more training, more time to implement. So I can't really say specifically how that would scale down to a smaller environment. What I'll do is after the session, I'll look up the specific person who asked that question and see if I can get back some more details and try to help out.
Yeah, then maybe more of a conversation involved there. I'm curious, do you see any difference when it comes to the manual labor cost? Do you see much of a difference between the packaged branded tools and the open source tools?
Absolutely. I think the automation side is an area where there is an incredible amount of difference between the different tools. So some of the tools out there focus very specifically just on automation, and they do the automation piece very well, but they may not do event recognition and escalation and topology very well. So the open source tools, a lot of them are very flexible, very script driven. But they can turn into a little bit of a do-it-yourself kit, right, where they don't have a lot of stuff out of the box kind of ready to go, whereas a number of the solutions like Uptime and similar tools, there's much more automation kind of out of the box ready to go that you can leverage before having to get into any of the custom options.
A question asked, do the next-gen tools like Uptime have deep reporting? I've seen some that don't have reporting as deep as the big tools. And I guess that's really a comparison question. How does your reporting compare to that of the big vendors that charge six figures?
Well, this is an area where it's going to come down to specifically which area of reporting are you as a user or consumer getting the most value out of. So certainly Uptime has very deep reporting with historical data back as far as you choose to keep it. So we have a number of users who are keeping data for over 7 years of historics for long-term capacity planning. So certainly the depth is there, getting right down to individual processes running on a target machine or individual transactions across a database. Now, depending on which modules of some of the framework tools you're using, you may find that they have more statistical depth in some of the reports. But really, it's going to be more of a question of, is that depth actually providing the value that you need within your IT department? So maybe a lot of those low-level, super granular, really low-depth metrics are really valuable to you kind of in the administration role, right, or someone who's focused on specifically maintaining certain types of applications. But are those metrics actually valuable to improving overall IT service delivery and focusing on those higher-level user experience metrics and the overall IT service delivery? Maybe not. So it's going to come down to your specific usage and whether there's certain areas of depth where you find high value, and that needs to come down to kind of a case-by-case example between different tools that are on the market.
Here's a question that relates to an option that actually was not on our second poll list, and that is homegrown solutions. And our audience member says, when cost is not a factor, such as in homegrown monitoring, what is Uptime's advantage?
Well, that's interesting that you say the cost is not a factor with a homegrown solution. A number of users come to us once they've realized that homegrown actually does have a pretty extensive cost, right? So that maintenance cost in terms of building it on your own, and then there's also potentially the staff turnover cost. So if you've built your own solution, you have a small team maintaining it, and you lose 1 or 2 people, all of a sudden you have no knowledge on how that homegrown solution actually works, and someone new has to come in and figure out the whole thing. Right, so homegrown is an option that's out there, and frankly, a number of large data centers do have portions of their environment where they have to use homegrown monitoring simply because the applications are too specific. But definitely saying that those don't have a cost associated with them is simply inaccurate. Many of them are far more expensive from a staff and maintenance point of view than some of the box products on the market.
Right. Yeah, they're probably referring to license costs, but you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
What is the minimum or maximum numbers of servers or virtual machines in a data center that you'd recommend using the Uptime solution?
Uptime is out there actively monitoring clients from 5 servers all the way up to about 25,000.
Okay, that's not much of an upper or lower limit. Is your solution agent-based?
We have a combination of agent and agentless monitoring. So we do have the Uptime agent available, which is a very lightweight agent, certainly in comparison to a number of the framework agents that are available. There's no localized DB and no always-on functionality, and an Uptime agent is designed to be very, very lightweight and not take constant resources from any target servers, because, of course, we don't want to end up actually impacting your production services. But we do also have a variety of agentless options. So if there's any APIs available on the target elements, we can generally utilize those. So great examples would be, of course, SNMP-based monitoring, which we do provide, as well as WMI agentless monitoring for the Windows platforms. In the case of VMware environments, we can access everything agentlessly via the VMware API.
Terrific. And with that, we come to the end of our question and answer session. Thank you very much to our audience for submitting so many great questions. There are a few that we will have to get to you back directly via email. If you'd like to contact David, you can use the email address that was on the previous slide, and you can find that on the download of the presentation. We hope to see all of you at those future Quinn Street webcasts. For now, this is Paul Gillen signing off on behalf of today's sponsor, Uptime Software. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great afternoon, everybody.